It's my pleasure to chair this keynote session. We have two keynote speakers. The first person is Sue McCluskey. Sue is the first special representative for Australian agriculture, promoting agriculture in Australia and overseas. And Sue has served as the CEO of the Council of Rural Research and Development Corporations. The floor is yours, Sue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. I am the first special representative for Australian agriculture, and my role is as a ministerial appointment. I'm an industry voice. So my job today is to actually paint the big picture for you, to give you a bit of an idea of why AgTech and the future of farming is so important and how I see it through a global lens. I am only a day or two off a plane from Latin America, and what I do in my role is travel extensively, both overseas but within Australia, listening, learning and seeing what the future of farming can be. Next slide, please. And next slide, thank you. So I don't need to tell you the challenges that we have coming to us globally. We have seen, of course, over the past few years, the challenges around COVID, climate change. We've seen what conflict has actually done, and conflict has not gone away. Indeed, it continues to grow. We've also seen the way the challenges to the global rules and multilateral system has been very much challenged, particularly by the ideology that has come from certain sectors. And of course, in Australia, we are very committed to free and open trade, and particularly for our agricultural sectors. And the challenges that come just seem to keep growing. Of course, recently, we have seen more about protectionism, and that protectionism is not just coming from one part of the world, but we see it in response to other countries in how they are actually seeing that protectionism grow. Cost of living, of course, is just becoming more and more of a pressure, not just on individuals, and particularly the farming sector. And of course, we've had questions about climate targets, whether they should still be there, how we're going to measure, and how we're going to achieve them. What all of this does, of course, is bring immense uncertainty. And for the business community and the agricultural sector, uncertainty means that they don't know how they're going to be able to respond, what they need to put in place, where do they invest in, and what they need to do to make sure they can be sustainable into the longer term. Next slide, please. So the challenges to trade, and the reason I'm going to talk about trade is a clear driver for Australia. Nearly half of our GDP actually comes from trade, and importantly for agriculture, around 70% of our agricultural production is exported. So trade and market access is critically important for us. The other challenges that we have to trade is that there are subsidies in many of the countries that we actually export and trade with. And subsidies mean that we don't have that level playing field. And Australian farmers are some of the very few in the world that are actually not subsidised. So that's also a challenge to our trading environment. Social licence is a key driver. And this is what I've seen very much coming from the EU, where ideology can drive policies, which then influences the global rules that we need to play by. So social licence is something that's very much at the fore. And of course, what we've seen very recently, and what we'll probably hear about in the next 24 hours, is in relation to tariffs. Now, tariffs will be a real threat for us, and this all just challenges that global trading environment that we operate in. Next slide, please. So I did mention the fact that we're not subsidised, and that doesn't mean that our agricultural sector is not supported in some way. But as you'll see by this graph, that our support in Australia is primarily R&D focused. So you can see that for producer support, most of it is actually amongst the least distorting support. And when we come through, we'll see the next biggest area is actually around the agricultural innovation system. As I said, our farmers are not subsidised, so we depend on increased productivity to be able to drive profitability. What makes the difference for us is money in our pocket. So if we can increase our productivity, we get more money, and we become more sustainable. So I think this is an important thing to remember, particularly when we're hearing these challenges about Australian farmers being supported. This sort of support is good. And some of the conversations I have globally, particularly with countries that heavily subsidise their agricultural sector, is, have you thought of repurposing your subsidies for better environmental outcomes? Because many of their subsidies are actually environmentally harmful. They actually encourage high pesticides and chemical use that can have an adverse impact on the health of their children. And if they just were to repurpose a bit of that money towards better climate change outcomes, to better environmental outcomes, towards R&D, we actually have the ability to tap into a bucket of money that is quite significant, in fact, in the trillions of dollars. Next slide, please. The other thing that we face is something called non-tariff barriers, and Scott will actually talk in his presentation about some of the things that we see coming from overseas, although he'll talk about it probably in an Australian context. Non-tariff barriers are those sort of standards, measures, restrictions that countries can put in place that are not actually seen overtly as tariffs but form the basis of being non-tariff barriers. So they're barriers to entry. And you can see that these non-tariff barriers just keep increasing and increasing. And they become a real challenge for us because we just focus on the tariffs. But in actual fact, it's these increase in non-tariff barriers that really is becoming a real concern for us and a real challenge to global trade and market access. Next slide, please. So we have a triple challenge, really. Wherever I go in the world, the conversations are all around sustainability, and I like to talk about sustainability, both globally and domestically, because sustainability encompasses climate change. It encompasses what we do around the environment, around soils, around water, around our people, importantly. So sustainability really is very much at the fore of what we do. Climate change is not going to go away, and I will come back to that. And of course, for most of the world that we trade with, food security is critically important, and Australian farmers are so well positioned to be able to contribute to global food security. We also talk about agri-food supply chains because it's becoming more and more clear that we can't just talk about behind the farm gate. This has to be sustainability right the way through the supply chain and how those supply chains actually can contribute globally. And more, what I'm seeing is the need to have credentials. But what we've got to make sure is that these credentials don't form non-tariff barriers to lock us out of markets. So our farmers are needing to actually come up with the data, the measurement and the tools to be able to report and prove what we're doing in terms of how we farm sustainably. Next slide, please. So one of the things I say everywhere I go is that agriculture can and must be part of the solution. Don't point the finger at us as being the blame for creating climate challenges. We actually must be part of the solution. And sometimes I actually bemoan the fact that consumers, and it's nice to be here in Sydney, and Professor Moran made the comment about it, should we bring agriculture to the cities? Yes, we should, because I actually bemoan the fact that consumers seem to have lost the connection between where their food comes from and farmers. Farmers actually have the ability to produce safe, healthy, importantly nutritious food and of course sustainable fibres. And our Australian farmers have very, very strong sustainability credentials, no matter what other places in the world may seem to think. In fact, ABARES did a really good report not that long ago where they actually looked at global data around the credentials and they actually adjusted them for two things. One, for the fact we don't have subsidies, but also for that point that Meg made very clearly, there is no one size fits all. There is no one same climate environment, no same type of soil, no same production system. And when it was adjusted, we saw that our Australian farmers actually have very good sustainability credentials. We have, of course, for a long time been shifting our land use into nature conservation. Having just come from Latin America, there was a lot of discussion around the EU's deforestation regulation. And they, in the Latins like us, actually have a lot of trees and actually are planting even more trees, unlike some parts of the world, like the EU, that are trying to drive this regulation. So it was a really interesting to be able to talk to them as like minds around this. Of course, no and low till, once again, we have this similarity with the Latins, that we've been putting these practices in place for decades, and we almost take it for granted. So we should be singing from the rooftops how well we farm sustainably. Stubble retention, of course, is something else we do. Less nitrogen fertiliser use. We use much less nitrogen fertiliser than many other places in the world. One of the things I actually learnt recently when I was doing some soil testing on my own farm was we are one of the few countries in the world that actually use legumes to fix nitrogen in the soil. Many other countries it comes out of a bag. And so, of course, that just makes us much more sustainably. Once again, we don't necessarily tell people about that. Less pesticides, of course, we're not subsidised, so we actually think about how much it's going to cost us and how little we need to use to be most efficient. And of course, lowest stocking rates, but that's really related to the amount of land we have. Next slide, please. So some of the things that I just want to touch on that we're doing here in Australia. We have developed an Australian agricultural sustainability framework. This is an overarching framework. It has 17 principles. It goes across the areas of soil health, water preservation, animal well-being and health, biosecurity. It is what I talk to globally. This is our overarching articulation of Australian agriculture's commitment to sustainability. It speaks to the principles of ESG, which of course is the language of the corporates, but it also speaks to the SDGs, which are the language globally. So wherever I go in the world, I put this up and they go, wow, we don't have anything like this. And there are a number of countries that are actually asking us for assistance to develop something like this. But you know, and Professor Moran picked this up really clearly, and I will come back to this as well. It's really important that we think about the link between the strategic level, the academic and science level, and what's happening on the ground. So at the ground level, what sits underneath this overarching framework is individual industry sector sustainability framework. There's a horticultural sustainability framework, a beef sustainability framework, a dairy sustainability framework. And for farmers, that's where they can go to see what is actually fit for purpose and the focus for their own industry sector. It provides them with calculators, tools and other information to help them understand what they need to do on their farm to become more sustainable. And importantly, it helps them understand what's the value proposition for them, that agriculture and the environment can actually coexist. Next slide, please. So I just want to touch on a couple of particular areas that I think are a focus in terms of innovation. I'm a beef cattle farmer myself, so I'm going to pick up on traceability and methane. So in the area of traceability, of course, you'd be aware, many of you in the livestock area, that we have had traceability from paddock to plate. So we have electronic ear tags. We are actually world leading in this area. There are a number of countries in the Latins that actually do have the ear tags, but we have that full NVD, so vendor declaration forms that we can actually, if we were to get an incursion, shut down a place at any particular point in time so that we're not shutting down the whole industry. The work that's being undertaken at the moment now is to say, how do we actually harness the ability of that technology in the ear of the animal and be able to say, can we get more data? Can we actually get data, for example, from the abattoir to feed back to the farmer? Can we get other information that allows them to demonstrate their sustainability credentials? So work is being undertaken now around data interoperability to see how we can get systems to speak to each other. Because importantly, and this is an edge we really do have, we are seen as being able to produce clean, safe, green, healthy food, but we're going to need to actually prove it. So this is actually going to help us to be able to prove it into the future. Next slide, please. So just a couple of words on methane. Once again, just fresh off the plane from the Latins, where methane was really a key topic wherever I went. In Australia, of course, around 70% of agriculture's contributions to GHG emissions come from livestock and come from enteric methane. And so there's a lot of research that's been undertaken here and in the world. And this is where I've actually seen some really excellent examples of collaboration through things such as the Global Methane Hub, where there have been an ability to be able to point out where there are particular priorities for different countries and connect researchers in those countries so that you can actually leverage, get the best bang for your buck when it comes to that research. Of course, it does have to be fit for purpose for the particular country, but we have in Australia some great researchers working on particularly the genetics. And there's fantastic work being undertaken here on genetics at UNE, and I've seen it for myself. Vaccinations, of course, you would have heard about the additives, things like asparagopsis, so the red seaweed. A lot of work being done around that, but also importantly work being done around waste, and we mustn't forget about waste. Food waste actually is quite a large contributor to GHG emissions, and the amount of work and research that's being done in different sectors, the horticulture sector, for example, and being able to, I've seen examples of broccoli, not just using the broccoli head for food, but being able to use the stem for chips, but also being able to use food waste for animal feeds and for other initiatives. Next slide, please. So certainly when I was at UNE last year, and thanks to Professor Moran and Lou Conway, who put together a great program, for me it's really important that I get to see the research on the ground, because when I go out and talk either domestically or globally, I've got to be authentic. I've got to be able to say that I've seen this, I touch it, but I've got to be able to give feedback back, whether it's to researchers, whether it's to government, whether it's to farmers. So this research was really interesting in terms of being able to measure the methane that is being undertaken. So I actually went through the work that's being done at UNE, but I also was able to see an entrepreneur, I think we'll call them, who's developed this tool. Well, it's a measurement tool where cattle can actually go in, they eat the feed, they actually can have their methane measured. That particular one I have actually seen in overseas countries. I don't know if it's exactly the same, but I was really fascinated when I was in Uruguay to see at an agricultural show there methane measurement. When I was in Uruguay, I also had the opportunity to go to the Research Institute, the Agricultural Research Institute, to see what they were doing around methane, look at what they were doing around measuring methane for cows. So I think this just indicates the work that's being done here, because this is the low-hanging fruit for us when it comes to GHG emissions, and particularly in livestock, and it can be a real game changer. The reason I like genetics is because it's permanent and cumulative, and once again, as a cattle breeder, I think that's where we're really going to get the gains in the future. So I'm just really excited about what the innovation is doing here. Next slide, please. So let me have a look at what else we're doing. I said at the start that even though we see challenges coming to climate change targets, threats coming from tariffs, the world has moved on. In Australia, we have a number of mechanisms that are there to be able to help farmers and encourage them. We have a carbon credit system, so that's a market incentive measure to encourage farmers to plant trees, sequester carbon, and be able to use it to offset against their own emissions, or even be able to trade in it. We also now have a biodiversity credit system. So that is still very nascent, but once again, a way to look at measuring biodiversity. We also have, in terms of meeting our Paris commitments, our net zero by 2050 plan. Now, agriculture and land is part of this plan, and at the moment there's some really good work being undertaken through what I call a process of co-design, where we've had businesses right the way through the supply chain sit down with government and say, how is this going to work in practice? Because it's really important that we get the value proposition back to farmers. But it's the finance sector that will drive this, and we have climate-related financial disclosures. These have been introduced and they will be mandatory for our largest corporates, and then over the next couple of years, the next lot of corporates will actually be included. At the moment, they're needing to report on their direct emissions. But over the next few years, they will need to report on their indirect emissions. And for any of those corporates in the agribusiness supply chain, those indirect emissions are going to come from farmers. And that will be the majority of their emissions. So we're actually seeing those corporates lean in now and actually look to help their clients, their customers, be able to gather the data, be able to have the tools and the calculators so that they can report back, because they know that in a few years they're going to have that information. But that's not all. It's not just climate-related financial disclosures we have. We have the Task Force on Nature-related financial disclosures. So that is work that's being undertaken now globally, once again, driven by the finance sector, that will actually be saying you now need to report on your nature-related financial disclosures. And in Australia, we're actually doing world-leading work around natural capital accounting. So this is really interesting, where it's being able to value the benefit you get from biodiversity, good soils, good air on your land, and be able to put it on your balance sheet. So that is the work that we now are part of a global coalition on, and the natural capital work is being done at the farm level. And what it's actually showing is the value proposition for farmers. If you look after your soil, if you look after your biodiversity, you will actually increase your productivity and you will increase your profitability. So win-win. Next slide, please. So to set us up for today, AgTech and innovation is going to be critically important. We can't do without it. And the science of tomorrow is really going to be around the bioeconomy, predictive agriculture, you know, what AI and machine learning can do. The remote sensing and satellite imagery, I think, is going to be game-changing. And I'm particularly interested in this, given that there will be a high compliance burden on farmers in order to gather this data. So to what extent can we use things such as remote sensing and satellite imagery to be able to provide the data back to farmers to be able to demonstrate their credentials? You know, I just think on my farm 33 years ago, if you were using chemicals in the paddock, you were using a tractor or a truck. Now we're using drones. So just the difference that makes in terms of reduced chemical use, more accurate use, and using the technology is really quite amazing. Everything, though, will be underpinned by data. We can't do without data. It's what's going to underpin the measurement and the tools that we use. And we're going to need to come up with some sort of common methodology, so we're going to be able to get comparisons. And having systems that can talk to each other will be critically important. Once again, picking up on a point that Professor Moran made, that at the moment we have it sort of a bit happening in pieces, and you get the tech companies that are driving their own particular software package because they want to sell it. We've got to make sure that we have systems that talk to each other. Next slide, please. So, what will build our resilience? Well, as I said, finance and investment will be a key driver. Money's what makes the world go around. So the train has left the station no matter what challenges are coming to us globally, and we need to be on it. We are going to continue to need really good, robust research to be able to provide that science and evidence base. That is critically important, and we must continue to say that in terms of where policies and frameworks and regulation actually goes. Credentials will be a big focus, and that's where data will be really important, but it must have a practical application. Once again, picking up on something that Professor Moran said, and I was really interested because innovation just doesn't come in the technology. Innovation also comes in challenging traditional approaches and looking at different ways of doing things and being able to connect the practical with the science and the evidence, I think, is really, really important. Of course, you've got to have extension and adoption, and sometimes I fear we don't put enough focus on this. We just think that science and the research will just be picked up because as scientists it makes absolute sense. That connection around the communication is really important. Collaboration is essential because we just waste resources if we just duplicate. But this bottom one is the one that I really am now starting to say everywhere I go. We've got to tell the story through the lens of the user. Every time I come across a great piece of research or a great piece of scientific evidence or even a great policy, I am seeing it through the eyes of the person who actually developed it. If we want to get take-up, we've actually got to be able to tell the story through the eyes of the user. And that's something that we need to make sure that we can actually bring together that technical and that communications to make sure that we can actually speak in the language that we need to make sure we get the cut through. And in the end, as I always say, if we have healthy soils, healthy water, healthy air, we'll have healthy animals and plants, healthy people, and a healthy environment. So thank you. I'll leave it there. Next slide is just the final slide. And I'll let Scott talk about the really technical stuff. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sue. It's a very inspiring talk. Can I remind everybody here, put your questions by scanning this QR code and also at Armadel's site. Our second keynote speaker is Scott Hansen. Scott is the CEO of the Australian Pesticides and Veterinary Medicine Authority. He's an experienced executive in the primary industries, bringing over 30 years of experience of leadership across various industries and government roles, such as the Director General of the New South Wales Department of Primary Industry from 2014 to 2024. Welcome, Scott. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And thank you for the opportunity to be here today. I also want to begin by acknowledging the Darug people here in Parramatta and the Ngunnawal people up in Armidale as traditional custodians on the land on which we're primarily meeting today, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I also want to acknowledge those elders past as being the very first agricultural and veterinary chemists of our continent, adapting and exploiting toxic properties of plants in their seeking of prey, including the use of crushed Australia indigo leaves to stun fish within rock pools. Ironically, some of the biopesticide, bioinsecticide, biocide technology that they deployed 40,000 years ago on this continent, I'll be flagging as parts of our pathway for the future for farming in my speech a little bit later on. Now, Sue's taken us on a very insightful journey with a very broad lens. So I'm going to narrow the lens down considerably, and I'm going to make sure I'm using the lens of the Australian Pesticide and Veterinary Medicines Authority, which for the purpose of brevity and time and getting my mouth around that every time, I'm just going to call it APVMA if I reference it from here on in. In doing so, I also want to acknowledge the fact that Dr. Stephen Jeffries is in Armidale today. We've divided and conquered. Steve is, amongst many things, a board member of the APVMA and also a panellist later today in your session. Now, when I'm talking about the lens of APVMA, and I have to keep remembering, next slide, please. Thank you. So I'm using the lens of Australia's independent regulator of agricultural and veterinary chemicals up to the point of sale. Our colleagues in state and territory governments have responsibility for regulating the use of these chemicals. But we regulate to protect the health and safety of people, of animals and of the environment, and to support Australia's primary industries, our biosecurity and our international trade. Now, given the fact that Sue's focused on her background in the cattle industry and focused on livestock, I'm going to concentrate my discussions even further into the field of agricultural chemicals and focus on the plant side of our business. Next slide, please. So, I don't think it's of much news for anyone in the room here that agricultural chemicals have been and will continue to be an important part of future solutions for farming. Now, this slide that I've put on the screen shows the close relationship between annual crop production and agricultural chemical sales over the past 9 years here in Australia. The green bars show the volume of Australian winter crop. They're green for my eye colour. I don't know if everyone else is seeing them that way, but the big bars are the Australian winter crop. The small ones on the top, the greyish ones, are the volume of the summer crop. And the line actually shows the agricultural chemical sales volumes that are reported to APVMA on an annual basis. Oh, sorry, if we go forward, that's it. I'll keep remembering that. Now, you'll see how strong a correlation there is between the production levels and agricultural chemical use. You'll also see that there's a massive uptick in the middle of the graph, which reflect the increased weed and disease presence due to weather conditions. Strong La Nina conditions, particularly during the winter and spring of 2022, which were the first real major break post the drought that sort of dragged us into 2020, the end of 2019. Those wet conditions contributed to a greater instance of disease in crops, such as fungal diseases, which in turn stimulated sales of post-emergent fungicides to reduce impact on yield and quality. Weed pressures are also elevated, resulting in higher demand for pre- and post-emergent herbicides. Now, this is a snapshot back over the last 9 years, but for those wanting to do a deeper dive into this, Deloitte Access Economics looked at the economic contribution of crop protection products, otherwise known as agricultural chemicals in Australia, in 2023. They calculated that $31.6 billion of cropping production is attributable to the use of agricultural chemical products in the country. That represents about 73% of the total value of production. Now again, the methodology for those calculations and the crop-by-crop breakdown in terms of attribution of yield and quality against crop protection products is all covered in that Deloitte Access Economics report. But interestingly, what they found is that over half of this contribution is from fungicides, due to the significant contribution that they make to the quality and yield production for vegetable, fruit and nuts in Australia. Now, it goes without saying that without agricultural chemicals, our production story, our story about how much food we produce on how many hectares of arable land across this country would be very different, and the food security story of this planet would be significantly different as well. Since the 1970s, when copper sulfate was mixed with quicklime or calcium oxide to create the Bordeaux mixture, something which is still registered for use in many parts of the world today, since that combination was found to help control powdery mildew in grapes, farming systems have been evolving and significantly increasing our productivity, in large part due to the role of agricultural chemicals and what it's allowed us to do and how it's allowed us to do it. And they will continue to do so into the future. Next slide, please. It's just the way in which we do this is significantly changing. Now, just as that blue Bordeaux mixture proved important in preventing powdery mildew in grapes and potato blight in potatoes, and one could only imagine what the difference it would have made to the world should that have been discovered 30 years before, allowing the world to have a tool to be able to respond to potato blight's emergence, averting the resulting potato famine, the mass deaths, and the largest single migration of people at any point in history at that point in time that resulted from that famine, and our inability to control a disease spreading through such an important crop. It was also, however, a forerunner to the things that we needed to ensure we were regulating and we were continuing to improve. The copper accumulated in the soil over repeated seasons of treatment. It bioaccumulated in organisms. When it was used in Latin America in the 1920s in banana plantations, it was actually nicknamed parakeet because it would turn workers blue due to how much of it they would be covered in. And now many of those obviously became ill and died from copper poisoning. Now, it took a long time for us to catch up in a regulatory sense to where technology had taken us in terms of the availability of agricultural chemicals and what they can do to ensure that we were protecting our environment, our animals and our people. And it's part of that lingering legacy of that creates some of the social challenges we face today, of either over-regulating to try to compensate or not being prepared for the next wave of innovations and therefore either potentially falling into the same traps of the past or taking an over-precautious approach and halting the innovations that might otherwise flow. But we have come a long way since then, and we've needed to. We keep needing to, however, as well. And this challenge of protecting the environment, protecting animals, protecting people, while continuing to protect our primary industries and our trade, is at the very heart of the objective of APVMA, and I must say is the driving force for many of the innovations that farmers and their suppliers are implementing at the moment. Next slide, please. So the chemicals we're using are changing, and across the globe we're seeing a move away from older chemistries to newer chemistries. This transition is evident in the number of new product registrations we're seeing both in Australia and internationally. Many traditional chemistries are being phased out, either due to new evidence of resistance in target species, environmental concerns, health concerns, trade impacts, or regulatory changes. In the past 8 months alone that I've been with APVMA, we've seen the significant reduction in the number of uses for chemicals such as chlorpyrifos, largely to remove uses in which there was an unmitigated risk to human health or to the environment, and we've removed completely all uses of chlorthaldimethyl due to concerns around human health. At the same time, however, innovation in chemistry and biological alternatives is not only filling the gap, but I believe we're at one of the most exciting junctions in time when it comes to innovation in chemistry and innovation in biological alternatives. Now, many of you will have been paying attention to these stories, I'm sure, but why I say we're at an exciting junction in time is when you see scientists at the US Pacific Northwest National Laboratory currently have projects underway trying to identify as many of the 99.9% of the compounds that we currently know very little about. Our project has identified that from a single sample of soil, depending on the soil type, there are as many as 1,000 chemical compounds in just a teaspoon's worth that we don't know anything about. We don't know their composition, we don't know their properties, we don't know their chemical structures. Add to this the fact that even with what we did think we knew about chemicals is changing on almost a weekly basis. For example, previously long-standing views or long-standing rules regarding noble gases, for example, their inability to bind to create compounds have been shaken by discovery in deep space conditions of argon hybrid. Now, it doesn't exist on Earth, but we've been able to replicate those deep space conditions to be able to actually create argon hybrid here on Earth, and now looking at the chemical properties in which that presents, but also looking at what other rules can be changed, broken, or reinterpreted with our new suite of analytical and physical chemistry tools we have available to us. This is all increasing at a rapid rate. Generative AI models can also now dive into huge amounts of public data, patents, publications, grants, and can help suggest chemistries and formulations that can then be tested in labs or at end-state processes. The results from the lab experiments or scale-up testing are fed back in the models to further improve the properties, resulting in a discovery flywheel. Google DeepMind, for example, has already predicted structures for 2.2 million new materials, of which more than 700 now have been created in the lab and being tested, and that's just in the last 18 months alone. Now, some of you in this room I've worked with for a considerable period of time will know that I'm starting to stray far way away from my comfort zone in talking about chemistry, and it feels like a long time, indeed it is a long time, since my chemistry and biochemistry lectures at UNE as part of my rural science degree. So let me put this as simply as I can. We often hear concerns that there is nothing new left to bring to the table in the world of agricultural chemistry. That what we see on the table at the moment is as good and as best as it's going to get, and the removal of things off that table sets to significantly impinge the future opportunities for agriculture. I believe we haven't even scratched the surface of the tools that are available to agriculture in the world of chemistry and in the world of biochemistry. As our collective knowledge builds, as our rates of discovery speed up, the opportunities are going to be immense. And in fact, it's going to be a hard challenge for us to work out how we keep up with these opportunities, how we regulate these opportunities, more so than how do we discover these opportunities. The pipeline of new products entering the market is strong. New slide, please. The strongest of all these is the biopesticide pipeline, which has all those same features of new discoveries that I talked about in our traditional chemistries, but it's evolving rapidly, driven by significant investments from major global companies. For example, CropLife Europe member companies have recently reported an investment of $7 billion Australian to biopesticides by 2030, and we're already halfway there in terms of that investment. Multinational investment has expanded the market's reach, strengthened our regulatory capabilities, and improved the R&D pipeline, supply chain and production facilities to try to enhance product reliability. Market growth for biochemical agricultural chemicals is outpacing conventional pesticides, with biologicals growing at a 12% per year compared to 3% per year for conventional products. This trend is fueled by not only the technological advancements, but also consumer demand for natural products, for stricter pesticide regulations, especially in response to non-tariff barriers, as Sue talked about earlier, and a global focus on sustainable agriculture. All of these are working together to create a great environment for biopesticides, and we see them becoming a major market force in coming decades. Now, bioherbicides remain a key challenge for regulators, but promising candidates in development could soon revolutionise biocontrol as a mainstream approach, and it'd be fair to say that we're seeing this occur faster in the United States and Europe than what we are seeing here. The United States now has over 2,000 biopesticides registered, and there's a huge uptick in both the US and the EU in novel microbes, both in species and strains. Next slide, please. Unfortunately, this growth is not mirrored in Australia. Now, part of the double-edged sword for us of our island biosecurity status and our strict biosecurity import controls is the additional burdens we have on innovations in the biopesticide area because of our biosecurity import challenges. Regulatory evaluation of biopesticides is also complex. We need to consider pathogenicity, toxin production, environmental impacts. Efficacy assessments are difficult. They need to account for the unique characteristics rather than applying conventional pesticide standards. And obviously, with biopesticides, product labelling has to be really precise to enable users to optimise their performance. In the new biological technologies, we see micropeptides, RNAi technologies, phages, and secondary metabolites are all not only pushing what is possible, but pushing the regulatory boundaries as we try to work our way forward. These innovations, however, extend well beyond agriculture and have got significant advances not only in our veterinary side, but also in human health side as well. And next slide, thanks. So how we apply chemicals is also rapidly changing. And Sue talked about the change on her farm in terms of application of chemicals. The past decades we've seen an increase in boom stability that allowed us to cover more ground at a faster rate. We've seen better filtration systems to allow improved atomizers to control droplet size, improved measurement and control of application rate through GIS tracking systems, allowing continual adjustment and control of sprayer and tractor operations. We've seen that move down to the ability to control individual nozzles to ensure exact application rates. But what we're seeing now in terms of the rapid growth of autonomous vehicles allow for further enhancements. Reducing soil compaction, more timely and precise operations. And if you remember back to that graph about that uptick in the application of fungicides during those wet years, many of us who live in amongst farming communities tell you only too well the pain that's felt by farmers who know they need to get out and spray their crops but can't get onto the ground because it's too wet to be able to spray their crops, and instead have to sit and watch a fungus take a hold and decrease their yields and decrease their quality of their products. It's got the opportunity to reduce labour costs and to reduce labour, increase farm efficiency, allow clear exclusion grounds for environmental protection, and reduces operator exposure to chemicals during operations. Next slide, thanks. The next major step forward we see at the moment is with green-on-green technology. Now, the past decade we've seen the development of boom-mounted cameras that allow identification of green weeds in a fallow field, allowing pre-emergence targeted spraying of these weeds rather than blanket application across the whole paddock. This is the green-on-brown technology. What we're now seeing, and what's available from this year onwards in Australia, is green-on-green technology, allowing images captured of a paddock interrogated by AI to differentiate between different leaf morphology characteristics and other visual factors to allow the identification of weeds in green crops, allowing targeted application of herbicides post-emergence. Now, this is able to be done either in real time with boom-mounted camera technologies or the creation of weed maps by either drone imagery or satellite imagery. Now, in the research that we're seeing made available to us, chemical rates obviously vary depending on the type of weed identified, but chemical use can be decreased by up to 85% in the trials that we've seen for the same level of protection of that crop. Next slide, thanks. One of the most exciting developments is the potential use, or the use of genetic technologies in helping us in this quest to protect our crops and our livestock. Incredibly exciting opportunities exist, including the opportunity to potentially bring back previously defunct chemistries that were taken off the table because of resistance built up in their target species. Certain chemical actives that have been made ineffective due to resistance, making them obsolete, are now regaining a second wind courtesy of genetic technologies that are enabling us to turn off that resistance in target pests. Good example of this is the work that's been done to use gene drive to reverse insecticide resistance in fruit flies. Researchers at the University of California have developed a novel gene drive system termed eDrive, which is designed to combat insecticide resistance in pest populations. This system employs CRISPR gene editing technology to replace insecticide-resistant genes with their original susceptible versions, therefore restoring the effectiveness of pesticides. Notably, the eDrive is engineered to be self-eliminating. After correcting the resistance, it gradually disappears from the population, minimising ecological disruptions. And in some of the experiments that have been done to date, the resistant genes are all converted back to their native state within 8 to 10 generations, or approximately 6 months. These advancements hold promise in reducing pesticide use and protecting valuable crops while addressing concerns about controlled spread of gene drives in the environment. Next slide, thanks. AgTech is, I won't say new because I've seen research that CSIRO were doing on these technologies at least 20 years ago, but it's recent in the media. The platform for a genetically engineered male mosquito carrying a self-limiting gene that ensures only non-biting males survive, reducing pest females and overall mosquito numbers through sustained release, is one that has created a bit of media interest in recent months, largely off the back of misinterpretation and false science around the risk posed to humans of such technologies. Now, I might just flag that whilst AgTech and what made the attention over here was around mosquitoes, they actually have a product in the field at the moment over in South America for fall armyworm that does exactly the same with fall armyworm and is a control tool for farmers trying to get on top of fall armyworm incursions. Something that was an exotic pest to Australia until about 5 years ago and is now increasingly endemic. Next slide, please. So, what does this all mean, and what are some of the conversations I'm keen to have with people as a result? So firstly, the rapid rate of change in the landscape for agricultural chemicals and the role they play in the future of farming is going to require three key things to keep pace. First is our regulatory settings. They have to evolve with the technologies, and this means two things. Firstly, we must learn from the lessons of the past, and we have to make sure that the community come with us on the journeys of new technologies and what those technologies mean and what they do and the risks that they pose and the opportunities that they present. Because it's by keeping the community with us that we ensure our elected representatives in government support changes to regulatory settings to enable these technologies to be embraced. Secondly, the regulators have got to take into account these changes, and for us, for example, this means differences in what efficacy looks like with new compounds and new products like biopesticides, calculating the difference now in environment and human operator risks associated with targeted optical spraying systems like green-on-green technology mounted on autonomous vehicles, which offer a very different risk profile than what's existed in the past to operator-driven vehicles with widespread boom sprays. We need to look at the interactions between the regulators and those regulating gene engineering technologies, such as the Office of the Gene Technology Regulator here in Australia, and the agricultural technology regulatory systems to ensure we minimise red tape and impediments to innovation in this space, whilst ensuring at all times we keep the community comfortable about the checks and balances that exist. Now, many of the examples, many of the topics I've raised here today are all about international partners, and we believe that it's only going to be through actively working with our international partners that we're able to ensure a consistent global approach and science-based approach to evaluating these innovations and the risks and the opportunities they present. Second thing that needs to change is the current value chains will need to adjust. For companies whose revenue streams are based off the volumes of chemicals that they supply, new technologies that see a 90% reduction in the amount of chemical needed to achieve the same outcome pose a significant challenge for them in working out how they price and how they set their business models up into the future. Especially in these transition years, you can imagine for a company that's selling a product that's going to be used in the first instance by people applying across a whole paddock at a set rate, whilst at the same time having an increased amount of their customers only require 10 to 5% of that chemical to achieve the same outcome by using green-on-green spray technology, trying to work out how you price such a product to not exclude those using older technologies, but recognising the increased benefits that come to those who are using the new technologies from a significantly lower volume is going to require re-engineering and rethinking business models. We're already starting to see this with some companies moving to you pay for a outcome on your crop, you pay for the protection of your crop against certain pests and diseases, irrespective of the chemical and the amount of chemical that you're going to use, and then that company works with you hand in hand to deliver the outcomes. Now, the value proposition for investing in new genetic tools that, if done right, could see your tool no longer be required in 3 to 4 years is also an interesting value proposition for companies and those investing in research in this space as well. And it poses interesting questions about the future models for research and investment in these businesses. So the value proposition being offered will continue to need to be re-engineered just the same way the products are, the delivery mechanisms are as well. And finally, all of the examples that we see and all of the opportunities we see coming forward require further integration of multidisciplinary science. It's that multidisciplinary science skills that are going to be required to generate the next waves of innovations. I know when I studied real science many years ago, I don't think we ever once talked about computer science. I don't think we even knew what to start with. Well, we talked a lot about AI technologies, but it involved rubber gloves and we wouldn't have contemplated camera technologies as a critical component in our crop protection courses. The diversity of science required for the next challenges means we need to keep attracting the best and the brightest from across all science fields to think about what they can bring to the future of farming. And that's where we're excited about organisations such as ATSE and the sponsors of today's events, whether it be Western Sydney Uni, whether it be UNE, Hort Innovation, MLA, the Australian AgTech Association and DAF, all working together to play their role. The biggest role I see is ensuring that we continue to develop and bring the very best of our science, technology and engineering minds today to look at the opportunities and the challenges for the future of farming. Thank you.
Okay, this one's probably not working. Now we have the chance for the questions. May I please ask Sue and Scott to come to sit at the front? This one's... Oh, it's working. Great. Okay, so we've already got 11 questions. I think many questions actually from the audience here and then many from the other side at Amadel. So there are also some popularity, so some questions get more likes. Yeah, okay. Yeah, then some of those are... so I'll start with Sue. The first question is pretty straightforward. Why is poultry not included in the Australian Agriculture Sustainability Framework? Poultry.
Well, poultry is not excluded from the Australian Sustainability Framework. What we have had with the development of the Sustainability Framework is different industries have progressed at different paces. Some of those industries actually already had sustainability frameworks in place, so they were the first ones to be able to develop a framework that sat under the AASF, and then we're gradually bringing in more industry sectors. I think, something that Scott said was really important. He said you've got to bring the community with you. You've got to bring the farming community with you, and it's really important that we can actually be able to articulate the value proposition for farmers so they see what is involved. So it's not as if poultry is excluded. The poultry sector, like every other farming sector, is working out what it means in terms of sustainability and how they fit. And I would say every industry sector in agriculture can fit to some component of the overarching sustainability framework.
Okay, thank you. The next question is for Scott. How does APVMA adapt quickly enough to the accelerating and diversifying range of crop protection technologies coming towards commercialization? Long question.
So I guess there's probably the short answer is not quickly enough. The longer answer is it's always going to be difficult for us to move in an isolated manner to the rest of the regulatory systems around the globe because we are a very small marketplace and inevitably for a company to do the amount of work required, and I've seen figures of up to $200 million US to bring a new product to the marketplace, starting from discovery of the right compound, all the way through to having the data packages required for registration. To be able to do that, you need to have multiple markets that you're bringing it through. And if you're trying to go on your own to set new ways of regulating, there's a risk associated with that in terms of who might be prepared to bring that data package to you as opposed to taking it to Europe or to the US or to Canada. So we try to do these things in partnership with our international regulatory colleagues. It doesn't help that we all have different frame sets around what we can consider and whether we take a hazards-based approach or a risk-based approach. whether we're allowed to consider economic value or whether we're allowed to consider alternative options. So all of us have slightly different settings that make it not as neat and easy as what a global system, if you tried to start from scratch, would be. But keeping in close conversation with the companies, we have regular meetings with all of the innovative companies about what's on the horizon. They give us a heads up in advance. We know that most of them will be bringing 2 to 3 new actives, new registered products, new labels to the market every year in a pipeline of innovation coming forward. And we try to get ourselves prepared for the types of products. We encourage them to come in early, come in quick, so that we can start to give them advice before they put their full packages together. But it's really that international collaboration that helps us try to keep up with it.
That's a great answer. There are also some popularity about the question, so I'll start from the most the most liked question. That's for you, Sue. How can customers or international markets play a stronger role in sustainability in agriculture?
That's a really interesting question because, you know, when I go to some parts of the world, and I'm particularly thinking of Europe, I sometimes am concerned that the customers play such a strong role when it comes to sustainability that they're steering us off in a different direction. So when I talked about social licence, and this is particularly pertinent when Scott was talking about the real game changers that technology brings, and I'm thinking about the use of gene editing and gene modification. The EU has a real concern with GMOs, and this has largely been driven by the consumers there. And I think this is really important where we have to actually be able to get the facts out there very early in the piece so we can explain the benefits, the health benefits, and we can dispel all of those myths that just perpetuate in social media. And that's a real challenge for agriculture. The finger gets pointed at us that we don't farm sustainably, that we don't have good practices, that using chemicals is bad. And yet you heard from Scott that actually using chemicals in the right way actually increases your crop production and underpins global food security. I think that bringing the consumers with us and educating consumers is one of our key challenges, to be able to help them understand how this is actually going to be better for them, and I think it's an ongoing challenge.
That's great.
Can I come in on the back of that? So the one thing I'd say is we have to learn from the mistakes we've made in the past, and the mistakes I've seen us make in the past is we start the conversation by describing what the production benefits or the efficiency benefits are for the industry. And that's natural when we're trying to encourage adoption and uptake by users. The community doesn't care about that. We've got to start the conversation as to what's in it for them, and we've got to lead our conversations with the what's in it for them, then lead to the how does it help the supply chain and get that to them more efficiently.
That's great. Here is another follow-up question for Sue. How does Australia ensure the diversity in agriculture production system is fairly represented at a national and international scale?
Look, there is only one of me in this role, and I always say I like to share the love. So any opportunity for others to be able to bring their voices, to be able to make sure that not only can I give them the opportunity if they happen to be in country while I'm there, or even if they're there on their own, but also to let me know what are the latest things that are happening so I can help. That helps with my knowledge. It's a challenge because Australia has a very, very diverse agricultural sector, and there will be times when in a particular area, you know, or particular market, you have a focus on one particular sector. But I think the richness of Australia is the diversity, not just of our production, but of our ability to tap into different markets, and that's something we should embrace.
Thank you. Next question is for Scott. Compared with the traditional chemical pesticide, what are the biggest challenges in promising biopesticides in large-scale agriculture?
Thanks for that. So I guess biopesticides are far more difficult to produce at the bulk and at the rates at which traditional conventional chemicals are. they're far less stable, they're far more subject and likely to have highly variable outcomes. Their use is often very contingent on the environmental factors at play when you apply them as to when you get maximum benefit or when you don't. They have to work in concert with the natural environmental conditions at play as opposed to work against them. I mean, there's some of the challenges. And those challenges then play on to the challenges in the regulatory space. You know, the way in which we do efficacy trials to determine efficacy of a conventional chemical as opposed to a biopesticide produces very different results for both because of that variability in outcomes based on environmental conditions, because of how variable the biopesticide results are depending on environmental circumstances. So we need to be adjusting our calculators and our formulas to that. There's some of the challenges around it, but at the same time, the opportunities are enormous. You know, to be able to deploy nature against nature is often the better way to tackle challenges, as opposed to try to come up with human and man-made interventions against nature.
Yeah, that's great. Another follow-up question from Bob. Do we have adequate regulatory science research capability in Australia to support fast-changing crop protection technologies?
If Bob knows where I could find another 3 toxicologists or another 4 or 5 agronomists that could deploy their skill sets to efficacy assessments, we'd love them. It is like one of the challenges for us is in terms of where we find the skill sets and the regulatory scientists. I mean, I don't know about many people in the room, but I don't remember being too much taught or told about regulatory science as a career pathway when going through university. And so it's how do we actually create, train and attract talent to be able to do that, because we are going to need the best and the brightest to not only work in the innovation side, but in that regulatory side of innovation, which is equally as important in terms of that pipeline of getting, you know, an idea through to the consumer and turning it into reality. If you have a weakness in any one of those supply chain, in any one of those skill sets, it actually pauses.
I'm just going to say, well, why don't you go to the universities when the students are finishing their degrees? They're all looking to where they go. And I have heard that a lot of students think doing postgraduate stuff has no value because nobody wants to know you. They think you won't be useful. Well, if they're useful, you need to tell them.
Yeah, and so the question in the room was, how do we better tap into the universities and get undergraduate students as they're graduating to convince them of the merit in postdoctorate work or postgraduate work, and encourage them into these fields. And that's something we're really keen to do. In fact, we had worked with the previous Australian chief scientist. She had built into part of her remit in going around to universities and talking to science undergraduates as they were graduating, a spiel about the opportunities in regulatory science across the whole of the Australian government, because obviously, you know, we're a small agency in that space. There's many other agencies in that space as well. There is more that we can do. It's how do we attract them in an environment and in a marketplace where, you know, our biggest pipeline at the moment is we bring people in from the universities, and we're able to do that more now that we've had the restraint of only recruiting to Armidale lifted office, because it is difficult to only recruit to one geographical centre in a day and an age in which flexible working is considered a part of the benefits package. But we bring them in, we train them for 4 or 5 years, and then they are recruited at double salary by the Sygentas, the Bayers, the CropLifes of the world, which is, you know, maybe part of our important role in that sort of ecosystem as well. But it means that we have this constant challenge. And when you don't get to build a deep experience in your regulatory scientists, you lose speed because everything is new or novel, as opposed to things being memory muscle kicking in and taking over. So.
Okay, I'm conscious of the time. A couple more questions. Just slightly shift topic. Gunilla is asking Sue, can you please elaborate why non-tariff barriers are increasing and how Australia or the sector can improve this issue?
I'll start with the second part first. Look, Australia continues to be very vocal at the WTO, the World Trade Organisation, although it's fair to say that reform through the WTO is, I call it a slow burn, someone would call it more like an icicle. But it's something we can't walk away from. I think we've got to continue to make sure that we can agitate and keep those voices, and what I do in my role is working with like-minded countries so we can be vocal together, so it's not just Australia that is pushing back on this. Look, the increase in non-tariff barriers, and I'll actually refer you to a report by ABARES that came out, I think, last week, that really was the latest work they've done on the large increase in non-tariff barriers. It's increased because we see countries actually revert to more this protectionism, to try and protect their own and to be able to put in place measures that stop or make it harder for other countries being able to gain market access. And of course, as I said, we believe in free and open trade. That means it's got to be two-way. We sometimes get accused that our own rules can provide non-tariff barriers for other countries. And, you know, I say, well, we're an island. Because we're an island, biosecurity is critically important for us, but other countries don't always see that. So it's something that we've just always got to be thinking of, how do we actually continue to operate in a free and open trade environment, but recognising we need to protect our own people and our animals and our crops as well.
Thank you. So that's the end of session. Just apology for those questions already being listed there but not answered, but we'll pass those questions to the two keynote speakers. They can think about it or maybe get in touch with you, because we got quite a few of them with a name on it, so we can be connecting you guys. Thanks to the two presenters.